In 1907, Renoir moves with his entire entourage, if you will, to Cognes-sur-Mer, where he buys a farmhouse. And this is definitely a sign that he has succeeded monetarily in his life. Again, if you think of him moving down to this coastal town, and that's what Cognes-sur-Mer is. It's a little town on the Mediterranean coast. And again, Renoir, when you look at this period of his work, it's what I've heard the word Arcadian paradise used for it quite a bit, and this is really what we see Renoir kind of going towards. Again, this is a coastal town, so it's a much different environment than what we think of as Paris. It's going to look a little bit more like his work from Algiers. And a lot of the reason we moved down here was his health. Again, he has rheumatoid arthritis, and it gets worse and worse as the time progresses. But when we see him move down here and we see some of the work that he starts to do, it again has this impressionistic flair. If we look at the landscape on the right, you can see this especially. We see a figure walking towards us, but it starts to get lost in the chopping brush strokes that we see. And again, this is something we have to recognize about Renoir's work, is the farther we progress, the more difficult it will be for him to actually physically paint. His hands, again, suffering from arthritis. There's always the story that his assistants would strap a brush to his hand, but later we find out that's not quite true. Those bandages would be for ointments and things of that nature, but they would have to place the paintbrush in his hand, but he could hold it himself. Another landscape here, and again, we get a certain amount of joy from Renoir's paintings of these landscapes. And as we kind of progress here and look at this last period of his work, a lot of this starts to go back to the Rococo sensibility, people like Fragonard, things that he would have, again, as a small child, probably painted on little fans, and kind of the ornamentation you might have even expected to see on some of the porcelain plates. Gabrielle is with them as well. In this beautiful painting, Gabrielle with a rose, you can see not only does she have a rose, but Renoir is also using this rose color throughout, not only in the table in front of her, but you can see these pink and rose colors in her cheek, accenting it in a very, very wonderful way. She will be with them for a little bit longer. Again, this is kind of getting towards the end, and the boys are starting to reach an age when they can go off themselves. But we do still see Gabrielle as part of the group as we move down to the coast of the Mediterranean. And here we have Madame Renoir and their wonderful little dog, Bob. Renoir paints her as this wonderful mountain of a woman. You can see she almost doesn't fit in the frame that he's painting her in, and a very, very wise, humble smile on her face. Again, I really do believe they had a very close relationship with each other. Here you can see the years have definitely affected her. Sadly, she will die in 1915, I believe. She goes and visits Jean, who has been injured in the war, and she contracts a disease while she is visiting him, and she will pass on at that time. That's still just a few years down the road. Here we can see that we're really starting to revert back to kind of what I would refer to as the Rococo sensibility, this ornamentation, this very, very lightheartedness, if you will, even to the point where we're removing some type of intellectual type of ideology within the work. This is meant to be extremely playful. Again, we have young Alexander as a shepherd boy with tiny little birds landing on his finger. It almost seems something out of a children's film rather than what you would think of as a painting by someone who would think of himself as one of the masters of Impressionism. But again, as we kind of progress here and as we see the years catching up, we start to see more and more Renoir painting, again, more ornamental things. And this is definitely one of the larger subject matters that we have towards the end is these extremely large nudes. Here at this point in 1912, it's been remarked that they even kind of reached this aspect of being out of proportion, with their heads being so incredibly small in comparison to their extremely large frames. If you think about Renoir at this period, I'm sure he would be looking at a model in part, but a lot of this he would just be painting from his own imagination as well. Renoir certainly had a desire, or a love, if you will, for the female flesh, and as we see in these last few paintings towards the end of his career, this is absolutely the subject matter, in some cases even reverting back to what we think of as a classical subject here, the Judgment of Paris, the composition of the three goddess figures, and Paris, of course, in the foreground, and we have Mercury coming in from the corner. But again, this is something that we would think of him seeing or even painting very young in his career. And again, he's kind of going back to this at this last part. If you look between them, in between Mercury and one of the goddess figures, you can even see Roman ruins or Greco-Roman style ruins in the background. Again, going back to this sense of ornamentation, going back to really just showing the female body as this ornament, if you will, of enjoyment and pleasure. And let there be no doubt, with the way that Renoir is painting these bodies, he very much is enjoying the idea of the female flesh in front of him. These all kind of harken back to the large bathers painter that he completed a while ago. Again, this very large composition. The women weren't quite as large in stature, if you will, but this last subject matter of these bathers, this is one of the subject matters we see repeated again and again at this last part of Renoir's career. Here's another one from 1917 with their backs turned towards us. The skin being very realistic, but the rest of the painting very much impressionistic in feel. Just the hinting of form, if you will, mostly relying on the aspects of color. And again, we do have to remember the arthritis, and that he probably is painting this in a whole series of time periods, and he's probably working much more on the female nudes and leaving the background much more open, if you will, and free, not giving it quite the definition that we have in the female forms in the front. Again, when we start to go through these paintings and we see this repeated again and again, once we reach about 1917, it almost seems like the figures are melding in with the landscape. We have in these bronze bodies, as I mentioned, this Arcadian paradise that we have Renoir living in at this time, and again, thinking of this type of ideology within his mind and what he wants to create. Again, when we look at this woman, especially the three women that are farthest, the standing woman, the laying down woman, and the woman with the posterior pointing towards us, it almost seems like we're looking at the same woman three times rather than three separate women if we look at their face. At the same time, we still do have a grouping of landscape work, things like this, that are relying much more on impressionism. And again, it might just be simply that he's not taking the time to refine these landscapes, and he's starting more with this open brush style because of his arthritis, and then adding nudes or defining certain aspects post being outside, once he's taken these paintings back to his studio in order to kind of finish them. But again, when we look at these, we still see a lot of joy in the painting. We still see a whole range of colors in front of us to enjoy. Still very much Renoir. It's just kind of reverting in subject matter. Young Woman in the Garden from 1916. This possibly could feature his last model that we see repeated, a woman by the name of Adele. This woman will go on, of course, very famously to marry his second son, Jean, after he goes off and serves in the war. But here we can see, again, this is very impressionistic. If we look at the face of the woman, this almost looks like a Monet's treatment of a person in a landscape rather than something that we would see from Renoir. There's also a form which we can gather to be a dog over to her right hand, to our left. But again, a lot of the information blends in. Here we have a study, and again, you can barely recognize some of the key aspects to it. If you squint your eyes, again, we have that figure in the center. It was kind of helpful, the placement of the other composition before it. But you can see this is almost to the point of being a pure abstract painting. If you were not familiar with the idea of the model sitting in the center of the composition, then you might lose it altogether, and you might just appreciate this for how he's applying the paint and the different colors he's using. And again, the kaleidoscopic Renoir, the full use of tones all the way around the color wheel, we can see. Getting on to the very end of his life here, Two Bathers in the Landscape from 1919, excuse me. Again, very fluid brush strokes, but we can still have an understanding of what's going on with this composition. We can see the form that we imagine to be the water, and again, we can almost see Renoir painting this outside, using these fluid brush strokes, not necessarily being able to define the forms in front of him because of his arthritic hands, and creating more of this open brush style, very abstract, but again, very much leading to this impressionistic style, showing that here at the end, he's able to kind of master both. The Bathers from 1919 is really considered his last big painting. The woman in the foreground is Adele. That will be the woman I mentioned previously. Here it's almost like their bodies have a ripple moving through them, this circular system that you can see starting beneath the model's breast and then moving down her body. You should also notice that there's a second grouping of women there in the foreground, and again, if we look at this composition, we can see that the landscape is almost fusing with the people, and it doesn't even seem quite a natural landscape as much as, again, a product of ornamentation around the figures. It was thought that Henri Matisse very famously saw Renoir paint that. So this is, again, a reminder of what Renoir was kind of dealing with towards the end of his life, in terms of his career. Of note, he passes on in 1919, but before he does, he goes to the Louvre, and he does get to see his work hung with the masters that he enjoyed when he was a child. And this is, of course, a wonderful ending to this story. We have him returning to the place of his youth and seeing his work put in amongst the masters that he studied there as a child, coming full circle back to the area that he began in some ways.